All right, Bashan, you're good.
All right, thank you. Hello and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. I am Bashan Horsley, part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. I want to thank everyone for joining us in this virtual format. Before we get started, just wanted to go over a quick few items for housekeeping. First, at any point during the event, all viewers, if you would like to purchase a copy of either Winter Counts or Blacktop Wasteland, you can go to the chat section where we will have links that take you directly to Politics and Prose's website, and you will be able to purchase a copy of the books. In addition to that, we will also try to have a Q&A section, portion at the end rather. So I would ask that any questions you may have for either or both authors, you would direct in the Q&A box, if you would, down towards the bottom, not the chat section. That said, let's get this here. I'd like to welcome to PNP Live David Heska Wanbli Weiden. He's the author of Winter Counts, which is a groundbreaking thriller about a vigilante on a Native American reservation who embarks on a dangerous mission to track down the source of a heroin influx. The book is a tour de force of crime fiction, a bracingly honest look at a long ignored part of American life, and a twisting, turning story that's as deeply rendered as it is thrilling. Joining Mr. Weiden tonight, we have Sean Cosby, who is the author of Blacktop Wasteland, which is a searing operatic story of a man pushed to his limits by poverty, race, and his own former life of crime. The main character, Beauregard, or Bug, Montage, is an honest mechanic, a loving husband, and a hard-working dad. Bug knows there's no future in the man he used to be, known from the hills of North Carolina to the beaches of Florida as the best wheelman on the East Coast, haunted by the ghost of his past self and the father who disappeared when he needed him most. Bug must find a way to navigate this blacktop wasteland or die trying. That said, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you guys for having us. David, it's so good to see you again, my friend.
Good to see you. We were just saying, it's been a long time. We hung out at, back when people still hung out in person at BoucherCon, and, you know, we became friends right away, and what a great time that was.
Yeah. Oh man, it was back in the before times, as they say. And you know, if I knew the good old days were the good old days, I would have done more stuff. Let me first say that I'm reading Winter Counts right now, and I'm a big believer in first scenes. Not so much first lines, but the first few paragraphs of a book usually hook me or they don't. And when we first meet Virgil, he's the kind of character that I gravitate toward immediately. He's bracingly honest about himself, about his situation, about what he's doing for a living. But he's also a real character because he's not superhuman. And for those who haven't read the book, Virgil is a vigilante, a troubleshooter on the res who handles problems that the tribal police or the federal government either can or don't have the inclination to do. And when we first meet him, he's as we say out here, he's tooling up on a child molester, someone that is untouchable by the tribal police. And the initial instigating event doesn't go the way you think it does, because at first, for a minute, it seemed like Virgil's going to get a beat down again. And I wanted to ask you, when you were writing, maybe not that scene, but that chapter, was it important to you to make sure that he wasn't a quote unquote Superman, that he was just a guy, maybe a guy that knew how to handle himself, knew what to do with his fist, but he was just a guy?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and just introduce myself. So yeah, I'm David Heska Wanbli Weiden, and I'm just really happy to be here today. Thank you everybody that's watching, and thank you, Sean. Again, it's great to see you. So this is in fact launch day. So my book just released this morning. Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, you've been through it now twice, and so it's all, you know, it's old hat to you. But to me, I had no idea just how crazy this day is going to be. So it's a great way to cap it off with you, Sean, because I've been hearing some chatter that you and I are considered like the young lions, or in my case, like the middle-aged lion of crime fiction.
I'm right there with you.
Right now, you know, that we're maybe hopefully doing leading the way, or so I've heard anyway, of like a new style of crime fiction that decenters the police, and instead, and I'll back into your question, and focuses not on police or detectives, but on other folks in the criminal justice system. And so, yeah, so Virgil Wounded Horse, it was important to me that he not be a Superman or have superhuman powers, or that he's just a regular guy, but he has a strict moral code. So let me give the setup because I think a lot of people probably don't know about the legal system and the criminal justice system on Native reservations. So I am an enrolled citizen of the Sicangu Lakota Nation in South Dakota. And so our reservation, is like any other reservation. It's rough times there. There's poverty, there's some drug usage, there's some alcohol, but it's a place of joy and happiness. But what folks don't know is that there is a law passed in 1885 that still exists called the Major Crimes Act. Now, the Major Crimes Act is a law which says that if a felony crime occurs on a Native reservation, then Native nations have no authority to prosecute those crimes.
Wow.
They must call in the FBI and the US Attorney's Office. So Native nations cannot prosecute crimes that occur on their own lands.
Wow.
So they have to hand it off to the feds. Now, here's the problem. The feds are declining to prosecute about 33 to 50% of these cases. So you have cases where maybe somebody has hurt a little child or raped a woman, and they catch the guy and they call up the feds. And the feds, for a variety of reasons, say, yeah, we're choosing not to prosecute this case. And they let him go. And so
Wow.
he's free to offend again. Now, what that means is there has sprung up a class of professional vigilantes on many Native reservations. So if somebody's hurt your little child and the feds won't do anything and the tribal police can't do anything, you're going to call up a guy like Virgil Wounded Horse and you're going to say, go beat the crap out of this guy and I'll pay you. And Virgil's price is $100 for each bone he breaks and $100 for each tooth he knocks out. So that's the setup. And this is a real thing. So it was important to me to sort of show that Virgil was not, again, like you put it, superhuman, but a guy who's trying to right some wrongs. But it brings up an interesting question, and we'll get back to when we talk about Blacktop Wasteland, because there are some moral questions here as well. I personally don't believe in vigilante justice, but I'm a dad. I've got 2 kids, and if somebody hurt one of my kids and I couldn't get any justice, I would be tempted to hire somebody to go out there and get some street justice. So there is the setup, and I'll stop here.
Oh, no, I'm fascinated because there's some stuff that I'm learning through reading the book that I wasn't aware of that fact, and I wasn't aware of the disparity between the legal systems and the sort of nebulous, Bermuda Triangle, if you will, between tribal or native law and lands and the federal government. And I can only imagine how frustrating it is because, like you said, it's up to the feds to decide what is worthy of a prosecution. And I can't imagine being a father or someone that's been hurt and realizing, oh, my pain doesn't rise to the level that is necessary for you to get involved. And so I mean, you have I hate using this word because it sounds pretentious, but there's a rich amount of storytelling that can come from that particular situation. Another thing that I'm noticing in the book, and first of all, like I said, I love what I've read, so I'm about halfway through it. You have a very style that I like. It's not flashy, it's not florid. You use very and I don't mean basic as insult, I mean basic sentence structure, but it paints this incredible picture. I'm instantly on the res, I'm instantly in Virgil's world. I can smell the fry bread. I can see the guys coming out of the bar, or I can smell the cheap beer. And so I was wondering, when you were coming up with the idea, when you were working on it, do you think that style comes from your background? Because if people don't know, you're a professor, and a college professor. And do you think maybe that style is influenced by your academic writing?
That's a great question, Sean, and thank you. So look, let me give some backstory here. Yeah, I'm a professor, but I'm a first-generation college student. So I grew up in Denver, Colorado, in a pretty rough neighborhood by the dog food factory, the railroad tracks, and the stockyards. So we had some bad smells in the air all the time, and but when I grew up, it's funny, when I talk to kids who grew up, I guess there's no other word to use, but poor, I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know it until later in life when I went off to college and I saw these kids driving fancy cars, and they didn't have to go cook food at 7 a.m. at the diner the way I did on the weekends just to pay the bills. So I did grow up fairly impoverished, okay, but education was my ticket out. I've always been a reader, like probably everybody watching this is obsessed by literature. So I did go on and get an education, and I do teach at an urban teaching school. My students are primarily students of color and first generation college students. And so now the question is, does my background as a professor influence my writing style? Maybe not the prose itself, because academic writing is pretty dreadful. I'm sorry if there are any professors out there, and I think one of my buddies is watching this, Tony Magliero. Tony, if you're out there, I'm giving you a shout out, who has a PhD in psychology, and he'll vouch for me on this. Academic writing is very dry, and I have written an academic book and a lot of journal articles. So I don't think my academic background influences my style, but it certainly influenced the content. So in the book, I not only talk about the Major Crimes Act, but hopefully in a good, narrative way, but I also talk about the broken healthcare system on the reservation, the terrible problems with food. I give this statistic a lot because people don't know it. The average life expectancy for a man on the reservation is 47 years old.
God damn.
Yeah. Now contrast that with, I think off the res, I believe it's like 78 or 81 for a male. So this gives you just a glimpse into how rough things are on the reservation. We have terrible healthcare. We don't have a good source of decent food. There are no jobs, 85% unemployment rate. You put all these things together and there are, some pretty rough conditions. And I wanted to educate people, but mainly I just wanted to tell a good story. So I'll stop there.
Oh, no, I get that same kind of question when people ask me about, where I grew up. I grew up, I make no bones about it. I grew up really poor. My mom and dad separated at an early age. My mom and I moved in with my grandparents. You talk about the smells. I grew up, if anybody that's from the South that's watching this, I grew up, we kept pigs and chickens. And my grandfather every spring would slaughter a pig. And so you'd hit it, you would smell that scent. The scent of chitlins has never left my mind. It's one of those tactile, olfactory senses memories that I cannot let go. So when you were talking about, the growing up near the dog factory and the yards, I really identify with that because growing up in the South in the rural area, and again, similar but different. Growing up in a rural area in the South, it's terrible healthcare. The only people that get good healthcare are the people that are wealthy. It's when I was a kid, it was 60 miles to the nearest hospital, and so. If you had an appendicitis or anything that was an emergency, 9 times 10, you may not make it. And so I definitely agree with you. I've used some of that. I wanted to talk about some of that in Blacktop Wasteland, talk about the just broken infrastructure in rural America and how it's bad being poor and white. It's really bad being poor and a person of color. And so I definitely wanted to discuss those things. And you do it so, beautifully in your book in a way that is, I wanted to ask you another question, and this is just my own curiosity. You use a lot of native language and words in the book, and I love that because I feel like I'm getting an education, with a good story. As they say in Mary Poppins, but my mom used to say it too. A little bit of honey makes the medicine go down, and so I'm learning about an indigenous person who's not considered fully indigenous and what the word is for that, and the word for chiefs and I'm sorry, tribal leaders and children and stuff like that. And so I'm definitely. Did you feel any pushback on that when you turned the manuscript in about the amount of native language that you were using?
No, and I did. My editors were great. They encouraged it. I mean, the issue here, and I'm going to be just straight up honest on this. I am not a fluent Lakota speaker. In fact, far from it. I mean, at best, I have a kindergarten vocabulary, maybe not even that, maybe like a 3-year-old. I can, if you put me in some Lakota speakers, I can catch enough words that I pretty much know what's being said, but I'm not really a good speaker myself of the language. So what I did want to bring in some of the language because I remember it growing up when I would visit the reservation when I was a kid. But I did work very hard to make sure that I got the slang right, because like any language, there are, slang phrases and all that. So I would go back to the reservation, and some of my family is still there, my cousin Jim, and I would ask him, look, is this the right slang? And then I also went to the tribal college that's on our reservation, and a couple of very wonderful folks there helped me with some of the words, and they stopped me from making some really embarrassing mistakes, So, so I loved, Echo Press was great about, they didn't push back at all on the language. For me, it was just, I was embarrassed. I was afraid of like screwing up and being embarrassed.
Well, you teach, like I said, I'm learning. I have there's an old joke. There's an old joke in African American community that a lot of people like to claim indigenous background. I grew up with that. A lot of people like to say we have, Native people in our family. I'm like, no, you don't. Stop lying. None of y'all are enrolled. None of y'all at the res, so stop lying. But I am just incredibly pleased to be reading your book and learning some things that I didn't know about the culture and about life on the reservation. Speaking of that, we had a conversation at BoucherCon last year where we were talking about the movie Wind River. And it's written by a gentleman named Taylor Sheridan. And, the lead character of that particular film, for people who haven't seen it, is a Caucasian man who is married to an indigenous woman. And as the movie opens, their daughter has been murdered. And that's not the story of the movie. The movie is the story of another, unfortunately, horrible murder of an indigenous woman. And I remember we were talking, and the thing that I like so much about your book is that point that we were talking about last year, is that I didn't understand watching that movie why Gil Birmingham wasn't the lead instead of Jeremy Renner. And I love that Winter Counts gives us an indigenous lead character that has agency for his own story. And I know as with Blacktop Wasteland, that was very important to me for an African-American character, that I wanted to have an African-American lead character have his own agency and not be the magical person of color sidekick. And so my question is, when you were writing Winter Counts, how much of that was a part of your thought process, or did the story just come organically and it just happened that Virgil Wounded Horse is the lead character?
It came organically. There was never even a thought that I wouldn't have a protagonist who was of color. I knew from the get-go that this was going to be a story, of an indigenous man and then his indigenous friends. It was actually a short story. So, let me just do a detour here. If you don't know Mr. Cosby, he is a fantastic short story writer. In fact, didn't you win the Anthony a year ago?
Yeah, I did.
Story, is that right?
I did. Yes, sir.
Yeah. So he is a fantastic short story writer. I heard him read at BoucherCon a year ago. So I wrote not as good a short story as this gentleman writes. But I wrote a short story also called Winter Counts. So that was the early version of this book. But in the story, which I wrote way back in 2011, I actually killed off Virgil at the end.
Oh, wow.
I killed him off. Yeah, I killed him off at the end because I wanted it to be a true noir story, and I wanted the hero to come to a bad end. But the story just stuck with me. And, for a couple of years, I'm like, I think there's more to be said here. There's more to explore. So I resurrected Virgil, and I wanted to see if I had the chops to write a novel. And so I'm like, well, let's give it a shot. So I always knew that it was going to be an indigenous protagonist. So, but hey, I want to jump in because we're doing a lot of talking about me. Okay. And I gotta, folks, if y'all haven't read this, I'm not sure there's anybody left who hasn't read it. Okay? but if there is, let me tell you, y'all got to go out and get this right now. Sean was kind enough to send me this arc, and I just devoured it. It is a wild ride. It is a great story. And let me tell you what I learned from your novel. And I'd love, if you don't mind me asking you about this.
Oh, yeah.
You have such a talent. I don't think I've ever read greater car chase scenes ever. Anywhere. And you clearly have a lot of knowledge about cars. For me, my first car, honestly, was an old Ford Pinto, but I read your stuff here about the Duster and how they fix it up. And it was kind of foreign to me because I just don't know cars the way you do. So how much of that comes from your own background? Is this informed by your own experience? You mind me asking?
Yeah, no problem. A lot of I love cars, but it was my knowledge of cars came by default because, as I said, we grew up really poor. And so we couldn't afford to go to a mechanic. We just couldn't afford to pay for a mechanic to work on a car. So I just started my first car. So let me back up. So my mom is partially disabled. She couldn't drive. So for a long time, we didn't have a car. When I turned 15 in 8 months, because when you're 15 to 8 months in Virginia, you can get a driver's license. I got my first car, and it was a piece of crap. It was a rolling wreck. It was a 78 or 77 Ford LTD. That's a boat for anybody that doesn't know. That's a huge car. It's like it takes a shuttle to get from the back seat to the front seat. And so it just was a piece of crap. And I just learned how to work on it. But I had a cousin who was the inspiration, somewhat, he's no longer with us, who was the inspiration for Bug. And he was a Mozart of motors. He didn't finish high school. He didn't go to college, but he just was born with an innate talent on how to fix cars. So I learned how to, adjust the carburetor to get more gas. I learned how to put on the head gasket. I learned how to change brakes and stuff because I had no choice. I had to be a shade tree mechanic because we didn't have the money to take the car to a mechanic shop. And so hanging out with him as a kid, I used to get in trouble all the time because I would sneak out and go out with him because he had an old Vega and he would race it up and down the back roads here in my hometown. And so the car chases, I'm glad people respond to them because a lot of that is taken from the feelings. I use a lot of sensory description because I remember being in the car with him and we were drag racing and, you look and that needle shoots from 0 to 80 in like about 5 seconds. And you can feel the gravity, G-forces pushing you back. So cars have always been a big part of my life. I actually souped up that LTD and had to sell it because I got 2 tickets in the same day. My mom made me sell it. So, but cars and I have enough knowledge of cars to get myself in trouble. So that's a good way to answer that.
Okay.
But
again, y'all, if you haven't read it, they're just the car chase scenes, but it's not just the car chase scenes. There's also an arc of the main character that, I don't want to give it away for anybody who hasn't read it, but there's just a superior character development and story and narrative arc as well. So I really enjoyed that. I don't know if you have anything to add about that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's funny that you mentioned about how Winter Accounts was a short story. Blacktop Wasteland, the character of Beauregard, I actually wrote about him in a short story years ago called Slant 6, and that story appeared in the final issue of a magazine called Thug Lit. And Thug Lit was a periodical that did hard-boiled noir stories published by the great Todd Robinson. And very similar to Virgil, I didn't kill Bug off, but I kind of just ended it in a very ambiguous way. And he just wouldn't shut up. I mean, I just kept thinking about him. And I was like, man, I got to do something with this guy. And I remember talking to Todd. He said, well, you should write a story about him. Like, after the short story, what happens the next day, and that kind of was the genesis of the story. But it's funny. I started out writing Bug as a very one-dimensional character. When I did the first draft, he's just a tough guy. He's Black Parker. If anybody knows the Donald Westlake character. And what happened was, as I continued writing about him, he changed and became more complex because I had more things I wanted to talk about. And so by the halfway point in the book, you realize that he is a very tortured soul, very much like Virgil. I think Virgil, I was immediately drawn to Virgil when he talks about his brother. And this scene in the beginning of the book where he comes home and his brother's making a hamburger, and he's, and I've done that. I don't want to make this I don't want to make this a despair off, but there's a lot of similarities between Red's life and being in poverty in the South in rural environments. So when his brother is cooking the hamburger meat and dipping the bread in it, I've done that. I know that. I can smell that hamburger grilling. And so, Virgil, he seems very tortured. I mean, and not in a pretentious or comical way at all. There's a lot of hurt inside of him. And was that taken from maybe people or some events in your past, or was that just you trying to create this character and give him some layers and complexity?
Thank you for the question. It was a little bit of both. So Virgil Wounded Horse is what is known on the res as an Heska. Heska is kind of an insult. It means half-breed. And the word originally meant translator. So it's somebody who could speak English as well as Lakota. And so those people were very valuable back in the old days. But the word evolved over time to mean again, somebody who's half and half. And it's, again, it's not a pleasant term that's used on the res. So
Right.
Virgil in his life has been beaten up when he was a kid, taunted for being an Heska, a half-breed, and he carries a lot of hurt. Look, I got some of that myself. You know, I grew up, you know, in rough circumstances. There were times that I didn't feel I really fit in on the res. I didn't feel that I fit in the city. So obviously I pulled from my own experience in that. So, you know, but look, a lot of him, you know, I've never actually beat anybody up for a living. So, you know, a lot of it is just made up. You know, the toughest scenes for me to write were, so it is his nephew, not his brother, but
I'm
same
sorry.
difference.
I'm sorry.
No worries. But the reason why that's important is the nephew. So Virgil is sort of a parent figure to Nathan, the nephew. And so I am a dad myself. I've got a 13 and a 15-year-old. And, you know, so writing these scenes where he's essentially a parent, and I don't want to give too much away, but in the book, Nathan, the 14-year-old nephew, his mom dies, and so Virgil becomes his guardian. He gets into some pretty bad trouble. And those were real tough scenes to write for me, because I had to tap into my own fears about being a dad and what would happen if one of my kids was hurt. Now, again, some people watching this broadcast, I think I know them if they actually are watching. They may have tuned out of boredom by now, you know. But I'll tell a story that is I've written about. So it's a little bit of a downer. I don't want to. We're having such a nice time, but my 13-year-old son a year and a half ago was involved in a school shooting in Colorado. So,
oh man,
he was at STEM school, Highlands Ranch, which is it's a elementary, middle school, and high school out here. And this is like May of 2019. I'm teaching, and I get a call from my ex-wife screaming, "There's been a shooting at Sasha's school. We can't reach him. We can't reach him on his cell phone. It's about an hour drive. I'm driving back, and I can't reach my son. I'm listening to AM radio. They're reporting 12 fatalities." It's every parent's nightmare. We go to this giant gym where there are hundreds of parents in there. Nobody knows what's going on. Now, the good news is that my son was okay. He did have to huddle in a darkened closet and listen to the shots go off 2 classrooms away that killed a young man. So this event, you know, colored what I wrote about. And so how could it not? This is a traumatic thing that my son went through. Now, he's pretty resilient. He's a happy little guy. You know, he just started school this week, but it was rough on me as a parent. And so I think all of us as writers, you know, we pull from our own lives, and, you know, to a greater or lesser degree. And so, yeah, the Nathan scenes were the toughest for me to write. But let me turn it on you. What in Blacktop Wasteland, what were the toughest scenes to write for you, my friend?
You know, as like you said, I've never hit anybody with a crescent wrench over a drag race. But I did grow up. I grew up in a very a loving household, but I grew up around men that had an inability to communicate, and so they had a lot of stresses on them. And so we grew up behind a bar, grew up behind a shot house, and you know, Friday and Saturday nights were spent them, you know, my uncles and when my dad was around, because he's in and out of my life, going out to shot house and drinking and stuff. And some of the violent scenes were hard because I've had a couple bar fights, and I'm not proud of that. I don't use that. I don't talk about that in glorious terms, because really, for me, it was the culmination of the idea that I don't have control, and so I've worked really hard to not give into that impulses. Those scenes were hard, but I think the hardest scenes were the scenes about Bug and his dad. My father and I had a very contentious relationship growing up. But after I grew up and got older, he's still with us, and we've been able to really repair our relationship. And so some of those scenes were very difficult because I didn't want to make Bug me. I wanted the character to have his own life and his own decisions. So it's not, you know, the character is Bug and Anthony. It's not Sean and Roy. And so those scenes were very difficult, and digging into those emotions, those feelings, you know, I think the best kind of writing is the writing where you tell the absolute truth, no matter how hard it hurts. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid. And so those scenes were definitely the ripping off of the Band-Aids for me. But I got through it, and I think the book is better for it, because I think ultimately writing is about honesty. And Winners counts, man. It's again, you have an incredible gift for setting and atmosphere. And again, like just reading, like I said, about halfway through the book, but just reading those first few chapters, I immediately know where this book is taking place. I can see it in my head. When Virgil meets with the tribal elder or the tribal president, and he gets his, the inciting incident, he's tasked to find out where the heroin is coming from. That conversation, I've seen that kind of conversation in dozens of bars all across the country as I traveled and been places. And so, but there's something unique about it because it's happening in indigenous country. And I think that is one of the great strengths of the book. But now I'll ask you a question I get asked a lot. Do you feel at all any pressure as an indigenous writer to quote unquote rep for the res? Or do you feel like it's writing first and then your indigenous identity is tied into that to a lesser degree?
Let me answer that. I think I'm going to answer it by telling you the sort of the lines and that I drew for myself. So there's a fair amount of indigenous literature that plays into some stereotypes. Look, I'll just come out and say it, okay? So the stereotype is that all natives are drunks, okay? And that's a painful stereotype for us, and it's one, that is hurtful. Do we have substance abuse on the reservation? Yes, we do, okay? But there is substance abuse. Right now I'm in a suburb of Denver. I guarantee you if I were walk down the street, I'd find 3 or 4 people abusing some substances,
Oh yeah.
So, the stereotype is hurtful to us. And I chose not to feed into that. So in my book, the way that I read for the res was I decided that I would make it that Virgil had some problems with alcohol, but he does not now. So in the book, he never takes a drink. He's tempted. It's in a scene I don't think you've gotten to later. He goes to a bar and he orders a beer and a shot, and he thinks about it, and he actually smells the beer, and he's tempted to do it. But then he remembers it. The smell of the beer takes him back to a memory where he had to go rescue a family. And when he went to it's a bitter winter. South Dakota gets cold, cold, cold in winter. And when he gets to their trailer, he opens the door and there's all this empty beer around, and he's hit with the stench of beer. And then he can't find the little child. And I'm giving away a plot. Well, I'm giving away part of the scene here. But when he can't find the child, and then he realizes, oh my God, the car. And he goes out of the car. It's 20 below zero, and the little child is frozen solid.
Wow.
And that actually happens on our res. Just 2 years ago, an elderly woman froze to death because she couldn't afford her propane shipments. So anyway, Virgil remembers that memory, and he pushes away the beer. So I make him tempted, but my decision was that I was going to make him not a drunk, but on the other hand, I wanted to be honest about it. I wanted to portray him as somebody who struggled and made some bad decisions, but owns those decisions. So that was kind of how I approached it. Did you have anything similar? Did you feel that when you wrote Blacktop?
Yeah, I think there's a myth, and I'll say it's a myth because statistics prove it's a myth, the myth of the missing Black father. And so, yes, Beauregard's dad in the book has left, but Beauregard hasn't left. And it was very important to me to show that, yeah, that does happen sometimes, but sometimes it doesn't. And the majority of the time it doesn't. And, Beauregard, for all of the violence and the action and the shootouts and everything, at his core, he loves his sons and his daughter. He has a daughter from a previous relationship. And it was very important to me not to preach. Nobody wants a 300-page sermon. You know what I'm saying? But it was very important to me that Beauregard be as good a dad as his emotional brokenness allows him to be. And so that was probably the main thing that I looked at as saying I wanted to make sure that I attacked that. And like I said, stereotypes are also, there's stereotype. That's a big one in the Black, not in the Black community, but against the Black community. And I definitely wanted to address that. I think also there's an idea about rural people that they're not smart, that they're sort of backwards. And I definitely wanted, Beauregard is the smartest person in the room every time he walks through a door. And I definitely, that was a little hubris on my part because I definitely wanted to attack that stereotype. And that's, regardless of color. If you're from the South, If you go to a city and you drop your T on the word tomorrow and you say mar instead of tomorrow, people automatically think, oh well, that person's not as intelligent as I would think. And so I definitely was sort of repping a little bit for the South a bit, and for the country boys a little bit in that. So yeah, I definitely those are two things I really did try to intentionally work on. Let's lighten up a little bit, I guess. So you said you were a big reader. What was the first book that you read as a kid or as a younger person that you realized? What would you consider your first grown-up book? That a book that was like a serious grown-up book that you read?
It's funny you asked this question, because I got asked the same question recently for an interview for Entertainment Weekly. So I published this interview like a week ago, and I had to really think about what they said. The question was, what is the first book you really remember reading? And actually I see it, you can't see it over here, but I'm in my office and I've got it. I've had it for many decades. So I was apparently a strange little effer, because I loved Edgar Allan Poe. And so my parents had like this old beat up set, the complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. And I remember reading it and just being fascinated. And I especially loved the crime stories. Now, I didn't really understand his language. I'm not sure that I understood how much I was taken in, but I was just fascinated with Edgar Allan Poe. Now, flash forward decades in the future, when I started loving, and do a serious study of crime fiction, well, obviously Edgar Allan Poe invents the detective story.
Right.
And so, it's funny. So as a kid, I was kind of laying the groundwork for crime fiction. That's the first book that I really remember reading. There may have been others, probably like some comic books, Peanuts or something. But right. As far as a book, that's the first one. What about you, my man?
I think the first, and I'll tell a little story. So when I was a kid, my aunt lived next. We all lived next to each other in trailers. We all had mobile homes, and my aunt lived next to me, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and she read a lot of Stephen King. And one day I saw her reading it, and I asked her. I was like I think I was maybe 10 or 11. I was like, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, it's a Stephen King book. You want it when I'm done with it?" I was like, "Yeah," because I always loved to read, and so it was Salem's Lot. And outside of the fact that it terrified me, it scared the crap out of me. It was the first book I remember reading where I realized the power that an author has, the ability an author has to evoke fear and passion and lust and suspense. And there's a scene in Salem's Lot, and I turned 46 last month, and I still can remember it. There's a scene in Salem's Lot where these guys have to take this box to this haunted house. They don't know it's haunted, but it looks haunted. And there's a scene where they have to go down in the basement. They drop the box off, and they realize they've forgotten to leave something. I think it's the keys for the house. And they do rock, paper, scissors to see who has to go back. And that scene where he walks back down those steps and has to drop those keys off, even if I read it today, it will make the goose flesh pop up on my arms. And so it was the first book I realized. I was like, wow, if you're a good writer, you can make people feel things that maybe they don't want to feel. And that was the first book I read. Now, of course, I read a lot of other books after that and books that, but I've never forgotten that feeling of being in the hands of a master storyteller and being basically manipulated in a good way to feel things that I may not want it to have felt. So yeah, that's, and I still have a copy of that book, man. I love that book. I've read it. I've reread that book a dozen times, more than a dozen probably. So now I wanted to ask about, you've also written a young adult book that's been out. Now, how did you find yourself writing about that?
Thank you for the kind words. It's not really a young adult book. It's a children's book. So the book is called Spotted Tail, and it was put out in 2019 by Raycraft Books. I'm not trained in children's literature, but I saw a call from a new imprint for writers of color. And they said, we're starting up a new press, a new imprint, and we want to provide some stuff for kids to read, that are, from their own background. And look, I said, I'm in. And there are a number of picture books and what we call middle grade books for Native leaders, not from my nation. So there's one for Crazy Horse and one for Geronimo. There's even one for Red Cloud. Well, my nation, the Sichangu Lakota, in English, we're called the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Our great leader was Chief Spotted Tail. And there had never been a children's book written about him. And I'm like, well, dang, let me write it,
Right.
So I really threw myself into writing this book. I mean, it's short. Again, it's for kids. It's for ages, like 6 to 10. Okay, it's like 2,000 words. But I pitched it to Raycraft. They bought it immediately. They brought in two great artists. One of the artists of the book, the illustrators, is indigenous, and the artwork is just superb. Jim Yellowhawk uses ledger art, which is a unique native visual style. And so I'm just really proud of that book. I do not get any royalties from the book. Instead, what I negotiated is I took author copies. So I have a whole bunch of author copies, and I sent one to every single elementary school and library on all of the reservations.
Wow.
And I have
That's
a standing
incredible.
offer, that any indigenous family that, needs one, I'll just send you one, which I've done. And I've gotten some, great, wonderful emails and letters from kids, and just the parents. They're like, finally, my native child can read about his own leader instead of something else. And so it really was just a labor of love. But again, these two worlds don't really mix. And I tell people, it's like, look, if you're reading Spotted Tail, do not give your kid winter counts, because when you get to the end, Sean, you're going to see it starts off violent and it gets much more violent.
Well, that's my jam, man. I love it. Like I said, I started reading it and I'm like, I was hooked immediately because, and that leads us to a question that's interesting. I get this question asked a lot about violence and how much violence is too much in a book and how much is enough. But my answer is always the story earns whatever you want to put into it. And so if you're telling an honest and comprehensive story, I don't think there's any, that goalpost is not for me to determine. The violence in Winter's Counts is very realistic. And what I mean is it's not, it's not Jason Bourne movie, quick cuts, everybody knows martial arts violence. It's, I was a bouncer for a couple of years. It's real bar fight violence. And again, like I said, when we started off, Virgil isn't, again, a Superman. He's not Jason Bourne. He's not Jack Reacher. He's a tough guy, a very tough guy, but he's also just human. And I love how you did that with the violence. It happens quickly. It happens brutally. And it doesn't go for 20 pages. So when you were writing the book, was that something that you took from past books that you read in the past? Like you said, you're a great reader, like I try to be. Crime novels that you read in the past, and what were your influences? I guess that's a roundabout way to get to it. What were some of your influences when it came to Winter's Count?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Sean. I mean, why I put the violence in there? It wasn't a conscious decision. I just thought that the story demanded it. I mean, I suppose if I had any model for this, it might be some of Lee Child's books. I love the Jack Reacher books. I haven't read them all. There's so many, but
I do too.
Yeah, and I think they're great. And I think he does violence well. But again, I want to be clear for anybody who's listening out there. I hope that in my book, the violence is not gratuitous. Okay, look, it is fairly intense. I've had, I don't read my Goodreads reviews or anything like that because I just think that's a bad idea for an author. Okay,
I agree.
But a few people, I honestly have not ever gone to my page. That is straight up truth, real talk. Okay, but I've had some people go there and they're like, well, some people are just not ready for the level of violence in the book. So, look, I want to be clear. There is some violence in there, but I believe it's earned in my book. And I would say the same with yours. There's some pretty brutal scenes in there, but I never felt they existed just for its own sake. I felt that the story demanded them.
Yeah, I have there's only one rule with violence for me in my book, and it's kind of silly, but it's my book, so I can do it. If a character uses a racial epithet in the course of the book, before that book ends, they're gonna be swallowing their teeth. And but other than that, I make sure that the violence hopefully is earned. It's not gratuitous. It's real. I'm very much a proponent of real violence because I think cartoonish violence gives people too much distance from it. Because for Blacktop Wasteland, I didn't want it to be violence porn, for lack of a better word. I wanted it to be painful. I wanted it to hurt and stink, and I wanted it to be real because real violence is awful. It's horrific. Yeah. And I don't think enough people realize that. and I wanted definitely to make sure that the violence in the book was not cartoonish, but that I wanted it to be real. And like I said, I wanted to earn that. And I hope it does. Like I'm not as strong as you. I've been to Goodreads a couple times, and most of the bad reviews do mention the violence, but there's a lot of good reviews too. So hey, that's fine. One more question before we let Sean come back. Now, Winners Counts, and I didn't say this at the top, but it's getting great reviews. USA Today, San Francisco Chronicle, as you spoke about, the Entertainment Weekly article, just great reviews all over the place. It is a book that I feel is necessary, and especially at this time in where we're at in the country with everything, and not just politically, but socially. And I think, do you feel that this moment where a book like yours is being published, a book like mine is being published. John Virtue's published a great book called 3/5. Writers of color and other indigenous writers. Kelly Jo Ford just published Crooked Hallelujah. Do you feel like this is a watershed moment for, I don't want to use diverse, but writers of color, writers that are not the traditional authors of fiction, whether crime or otherwise? Or do you feel that maybe it's just a trend? I'm interested in your thoughts about that.
I do think we're having a moment. I think it's a real serious moment. I mean, you and I both know that when you sell a book, there's like a 1.5 to 2 year lag time from the time you sell it to the time it appears. It's at least a 1.5 and sometimes 2 years, And so, look, when I sold this 2 years ago to my wonderful editor, Zach Wagman, and now I work with the equally wonderful Helen Otzma at Echo. We didn't have any idea, obviously, what was going to happen in this country, pandemic, George Floyd, all this, and I'm assuming, when you sold Blacktop, there was no way. But strangely enough, I think we're in a moment right now where you're seeing a lot of writers of color, and not just writers of color, but previously marginalized voices that are out there right now. And it's all seeming to come together. There was an article in the New York Times about 2 or 3 weeks ago about how indigenous science fiction, horror, and fantasy writers, including my buddy Stephen Graham Jones, are just transforming those genres. You were noted in that New York Times article written by John Fram about how crime writers of color are working to decenter the narrative. So it's not always just a cop, sometimes it's other folks. So I think we're in a moment, and I want to say that I'm working on an essay for Crime Reads right now, and arguing that I think it's also hopefully time for indigenous crime writers. There have not been, with the exception of my friend Marcy Rendon, there haven't been a lot of indigenous crime writers for a while. There was a little moment in the 90s and 2000s, but it's been sort of a desert for a while. But again, I want to be clear, Marcy Rendon is a wonderful exception, and there's some others, and especially in Canada, but I think it's also time for native crime writers to enter this story as well. And so, I think it's a moment. Now, is it just a trend, or is this really a watershed moment? I don't know, man. I hope it's not just a trend. I hope that people are going to start opening up, their eyes to a whole multiplicity of voices,
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's a moment. I don't know if it's a trend. It just feels different. It feels different. There was a time growing up when I read horror or crime fiction. Nobody looked like me. Nobody looked like you. And don't get me wrong, I love those books that I grew up with: Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Clive Barker, old Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, and of course Dennis Lehane. It was a long time before you saw Walter Mosley for me. Yeah. And then even seeing Walter, it was a long time before I saw anybody else that looked like him. And so when I look around now and I see the incredible work that you're doing, or there's two writers that have similar, their names are the same, and they're both great writers. Kelly Jo Ford that wrote Crooked Hallelujah, and Kelly J. Ford that wrote a great LGBTQ crime novel set in Arkansas called Cottonmouth. And so, there's people like Kelly Garrett who are writing, funny Black girl magic cozy mysteries like the Detective by Day series, or Alexia Gordon, who writes on a beautiful cozy mystery that's set in the world of symphony musicians with a person of color as the lead. And so, like you said, I think there's a turning point that's happening right now with traditionally marginalized writers. PJ Vernon, who's a great friend of mine, has a book that's sold, an LGBTQ centered book. And so I do think those things are changing and turning. And I don't think it's a trend. I mean, maybe that's the optimist in me, but I feel like there is a widening, an opening of the gyre, so to speak, and all these people are coming in. And I think the world and publishing is better for it. For me personally, speaking just as a reader, reading winners count. I'm someone who I have always been curious and interested about Native culture, but it made me realize I know nothing. I know nothing. I'm a neophyte when it comes to that. And so reading this book and entering Virgil's world is great as just a crime novel. It's just a great crime novel, but the fact that it's an indigenous crime novel, it just turns it up to 11. And so I wish you the best of success with it. I'm so happy it's out. I can't wait to finish it. And man, I couldn't be happier for you, man. I'm bursting at the seams for you. So
well, it all comes right back at you. You know, when you and I first met in October, you know, we talked about, we didn't know how this was going to go. You and I were some of the first to, you know, sign with the Big Five, and we didn't know how all this was going to go. And, you know, it seems to be going great. And so you know, everything you said comes right back at you tenfold. I'm thrilled for the success of your novel. I was glued to it. You know, I loved it. The ending scene was great. The character development, you know, learning about the car stuff, learning about, you know, none of us can know everything about everything. I didn't know a lot about the Southern rural noir that you talk about here. So, you know, that's what really a good novel does for us, right? It takes us to a different place and it educates us and brings us into that world. So trust me, folks, it's Blacktop Wasteland. It's some good stuff. So
well, we'll get Mashawn back in here if he's listening, and we'll take some questions if we got time. But I'll say, hey, if you're out there right now, please pick up Winter Counts. It is like nothing you've ever read before. If you know, if you liked Wind River, you'll really love this because it's got a great indigenous character with his own agency telling his own story by a great storyteller. So I'm going to turn it over to Mashawn now.
Thank you, Sean. So yeah, we have a few minutes and we do have a few questions here. But first, before a question, wanted to just put a comment. This is from Don Allen, and he said he just wants to compliment both authors for making their books sound so great. And he does plan on reading both books. And he wanted to thank you both for an excellent event. That said, let's turn to, well, Heather says to Sean, does anyone ever forget the smell of chitlins? And my grandmother used to cook them all the time, so I can say no.
Oh, no, yeah, you never forget it. Trust me. Once you smell it, you always remember it. So,
but here's a pretty good question. This is from Joseph Caslow. He says, terrific book. I am taken in by your talent for a good turn of phrase. Example, it was only 10 and it was already hot as hell. When he stepped off the porch, he could feel the sun beating down on him like he owed it money. Do these come naturally, or do you spend hours pacing the floor of your den before coming up with them?
I'm going to sound like a jerk when I say this, but it comes pretty naturally. I grew up in a household of very gregarious, extroverted storytellers and barbecue pit pontificators. And so there's always a sassy, snazzy turn of phrase in my household. So thank you for that. I'm glad people appreciate it. But yeah, if you ask my friends, they'll tell you that it comes too naturally. I need to shut up sometimes. So
if some of these other ones are more or so comments that you guys can read, but Heather asked David, not really so much about the book, but how can non-natives support the natives? And also, or part of it, is there a way to respectfully partake in any of the culture?
Two great questions. First of all, I really appreciate anyone who wants to come in and support Native culture and causes. My website, which is davidweiden.com, you know, you can look it up, you know. I think it's in the book club section. I list some links for some great organizations that are working. One of them is the Native American Rights Fund. So I don't talk about this a lot, but I'm taking some of the proceeds from this book, and I'm going to be working with a legal organization to try and whatever notoriety I get or attention I get, I'm going to be working to try and get the Major Crimes Act either overturned or at least amended. And so I've already been in some discussions and some talks with some folks. And so, I want some good to come out of this book in a very real way, if that's at all possible. So there are links on my page, but also you can just Google the Native American Rights. Thank you. The Native American Rights Fund is a great one. There are just so many, the American Indian College Fund, there are just a ton of really, really good Native organizations. But the second question is there a way for, I think you said something like non-natives to learn and participate respectfully? And absolutely. First of all, you can read books, not just my book, but Sean mentioned Kelly Jo Ford. Her book, Crooked Hallelujah, is great. My partner, Erica Worth, is a Native writer. She writes short stories, poetry, novels. There, my buddy, Stephen Graham Jones, there are dozens, if not hundreds of us. And you can also go to some of our cultural events. There are powwows in every state. And go to a powwow, which is, if you don't know, of course, it's a gathering. You can watch Native dancing, listen to Native music. Just go and be respectful. Don't be snapping pictures unless you ask first and stuff like that. We truly welcome non-natives coming in and learning about the culture. I think that's just good for everyone. So thank you for the wonderful question.
Okay, and we are closing out, well, getting close to the end. So I wanted to ask both Sean and David, are either of you currently reading any book? And if you are, could you share that with everyone?
I'll go really quick. I'm actually currently reading Winter Counts. I can get one of these days. I'm gonna get the damn title right. Winter Counts. I'm reading that now. I'm simultaneously reading When These Mountains Burn by David Joy. And on deck next that I can't wait to read is a book of short stories called Love and Other Criminal Behavior by Nikki Dolson. So those three books are out now. Please pick them up. Those are my three recommendations. So.
I'll give some three quickly as well. I already read Sean's book, and so I'll recommend it again. I just finished this book last night. It is, or a couple days ago. It is This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger. I did a reading with him last night. He's a Caucasian guy, and this is about Native boarding schools, but he writes it from the perspective of two white kids that are taken to a Native boarding school. So there are no appropriation issues. This book is superb. He's a crime writer, but this is a book of literary fiction. And I was just blown away by it. This guy is just a masterful writer. Nikki Dolson's book, I got it as well. What's called Love and Other Criminal Behaviors. I got it. Nikki is great. And she has a real gift for short stories. So let me second that one. Let me give another recommendation that folks may not have seen. This is by a friend of mine. He's a friend of David Joy as well, Wesley Brown. He has a book called Hillbilly Hustle. And it's on West Virginia Press. So, you have to dig a little bit to get it. But if you like, a cool plot, if you like learning about poker playing, so he takes us into that world, okay, and dealing some weed, okay, and who doesn't like that, okay, so this is a fun book. I met Wes at the Tin House Writing Workshop a couple years ago, and this book, it deserves some attention. So there you go.
All right. Well, let me thank both of the authors very much. Thank all the participants for hanging out and participating in this event. And again, the links to the books, Winter Counts and both Blacktop Wasteland are here in the chat. And want you guys to have a good evening. And thank you very much for participating for PNP Live.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, David. I can't wait. Hopefully we'll see each other again soon, my friend.
Great seeing you. Same here. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Take care.